This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Peru's politics remain a mess, with a president with just a 5% approval rating. On today's podcast, we'll explore how, nevertheless, rising commodities prices and investment from China may have the country on the verge of a new era of healthy economic growth.
We have a port, not a port, but 8 ports that are going to be inaugurated, all of them looking at the Pacific and taking advantage of Peru's strategic point in the Pacific. In general, this is a big opportunity to essentially benefit from trade with not only China, but all of the Asia Pacific. No? For some reason, we never exploit that. And the Chinese have come and simply show us that we do have a strategic position.
Peru has in recent years become something of a fallen star in Latin America. Its famously fractious politics, with 6 presidents in 7 years, have taken their toll on the economy, which contracted 0.6% in 2023, with a modest recovery expected for this year. The current president, Dina Boluarte, took office after her predecessor, Pedro Castillo, staged a failed attempt at a self-coup. Now, Boluarte has an approval rating of just 5%, which is low even by the standards of Peruvian leaders. But today on the show, we're going to try to take a fresh look at the country. Our guest is Alfredo Thorne, who was Peru's finance and economy minister from 2016 to 2017. He's now the principal director at Thorne and Associates, a Lima-based advisory firm. Alfredo wrote a just-published article for America's Quarterly, which you can find on our website, that spells out a surprisingly optimistic view of what may lie ahead for Peru's economy. And that's the opportunity that comes from high copper prices and 8 new ports expected to be usable by 2025. In today's conversation, we'll discuss whether Peru can take full advantage of this opportunity, whether it can translate that opportunity into equitable economic growth, which might, at least theoretically, make the politics a bit less contentious. And we'll also examine the prominent role of China in this story, and whether Peru is another example of a country in the region where the United States is losing economic and geopolitical influence. Alfredo, thanks for being here. Welcome to the America's Quarterly Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and hope this goes well.
Let's hope so. Alfredo, I want to talk about your article, but first I want to ask you a question about the current politics of Peru. Dina Boluarte, a new poll has her at just 5% approval rating. And my question to you is, how does someone get that low? I remember when Michel Temer in Brazil was at 3%. But it's a very unusual thing. What has to happen in order for a president to get as low as 5?
This is now a sort of a Guinness record here in Peru. I think my sense is that she has done everything wrong. In general, everybody is very much against her. I think in general, the population is very fed up with politicians that are crooks, no? And that has been the case, well, since Kuczynski was out. Then we had Vizcarra, but we have a series of presidents that in general have been given their backs to the population, and they have been consistently lying.
Just for context here, Dina Boluarte's administration has seen several corruption scandals, including most recently over her brother's arrest for alleged influence peddling. All involved deny any wrongdoing, including the president.
Let me make a note there. Not only that she had lied, but she now is trying to, through a legal strategy, she's trying to prevent any investigations on her, which actually gets the population even more furious.
Well, that makes sense now. I'm starting to understand a little better why she's at 5%. So let's move past the politics here, Alfredo, because your article for America's Quarterly essentially makes the case that even though the politics in Peru continue to be a mess, there are reasons for optimism. And specifically, you see an opportunity for improvement of Peru's economy. Why?
We Peruvians say that either we do things well or we got benefits from the foreign world. We have the copper price at their peak, and probably what most people and I myself believe is going to keep on going up. And then we have a port, not a port, but 8 ports that are going to be inaugurated, all of them looking at the Pacific and taking advantage of Peru's strategic point in the Pacific. In general, this is a big opportunity to essentially benefit from trade with not only China, but all of the Asia Pacific. No, this is something that is completely exogenous to us, but certainly something that we should take advantage of. No,
You note this increase in copper prices, and it is a record high. As we record this, benchmark copper prices at the London Metal Exchange surged last week to above 11,000 per metric ton. That surpasses by a bit the previous peak set in 2022. And as you write, Peru has the largest copper reserves and one of the lowest costs of extraction. What would be necessary, though, for Peru to benefit from this peak? Because as we've seen, not just in Peruvian history, but in other countries as well, it does not naturally follow that high commodities prices lead to an overall bonanza or even growth for the economy.
I think it's not difficult for Peru to get advantage of that. And I point out in the article 3 factors that they have to sort of meet. Our government has put too much red tape, and I think a fast track approval of some of the good mining project should be the first one. The second one, we have to rethink on a different way of splitting the profits from the mining exploitations. It does happen that most of the mining exploitations are in areas where we have poor communities. And I think it's a double benefit from us to take out the copper or the other minerals and at the same time benefit the population. And finally, we need to do a social program that actually reaches out not only in terms of poverty alleviation, but in terms of employment opportunities, in terms of housing, in terms of many areas on social protection that these populations should take advantage.
You were previously a finance minister of Peru. Why was this more equitable pattern of distribution? Why wasn't this done in the past?
Well, we did some of that. For instance, when you look at the Anglo-American project, the Quellaveco is a mining development that has invested close to $5 billion, and it doesn't have a single protest in Quellaveco. No, it's actually completely clean. And I think probably people outside Peru don't know, but there are certain enterprises that have done their exploitation of the mining sector pretty well, and others that probably have gotten into trouble. But I think we have a lot of very good examples of how to do these mining exploitations in a good shape. No?
Alfredo, does security pose a risk to this more positive mining story?
Obviously, security is a problem, but the big problem is not necessarily security, is the informal mining. We call it informal, illegal, and obviously they use strategies that end up contaminating our biodiversity. But I think we have, as a government, we have not given a solution to the informal mining. We have not brought them in and turned them into formal mining. And that's another area that we try to solve. When I was finance minister, for instance, we suggest the creation of a mining fund that will buy the gold from the informal miners in exchange for them turning formal, complying with environmental standards, complying with the communities, etc. Note that today those miners sell their gold at 50% of the price to Bolivia. And if we put together a mining fund that buy that gold at rates of around 80, 90%, that will be a huge benefit to them and a huge benefit to society by formalizing them.
Informality has been a challenge for Peru kind of across the economy. The percentage of workers in the informal sector is upwards of 70%. That's well above the Latin American average. Why has this been so difficult for Peru?
I think there are many different theories behind that. One is that low income workers that they find a way of incorporating themselves in the labor force by joining the informal market. But the truth of the matter is that we have made formality very, very expensive. If you look at how much a worker costs to an enterprise, it will cost between 40 and 50% of additional labor cost. And I think, for instance, when I was a finance minister, we made the formalization of the economy the driver of our policies. We tried to implement a formalization policy. Unfortunately, I lasted very little, 1 year, but that's the way to go. I think the way to go is to reduce those excessive costs. And I believe that we could provide social protection at a lower cost and incorporate most of that informality into the formality, or probably bring us or align us to the other developing countries' levels of informality.
Alfredo, the economic history of Peru and perhaps Latin America more broadly speaking, of course, has been driven by commodities. And the record of progress is uneven. You mentioned in your article that Peru's history has been plagued with these opportunities, as you put it. And you went all the way back to the guano boom of the 1850s and kind of talked about some of that history. Can you discuss that a little bit here? I mean, how linked is Peru's history to these commodity cycles?
The fact that we have benefit from these commodity booms has in a way prevent us from going into different type of developments like industry or services. It has made other investments less attractive than mining. It's like a Dutch disease in terms of oil. The truth of the matter is that it has resulted, in my view, in a very divided society. The groups that benefit from mining and from the modern part of the economy usually are in Lima, but those benefits have not filtered down to the low income that are in provinces. My sense is when I talk about the opportunity, I think the opportunity is precisely to tackle that divide between provinces and Lima. I think if we do a very well focused social program where we incorporate to the society the different communities, and there is evidence that those communities want to be connected to the rest of the world, then that's the route for development in Peru. That's my view.
At America's Quarterly, we always try to strike this balance between imagining the world as we'd like it to look and talking about the world the way it is. And so, my question for you is how likely is it that this Peruvian Congress and this Peruvian government might be able to approve some kind of social distribution scheme, the likes of which you're suggesting?
I think it's likely. I think the problem is that nobody has put that program in their tables. They are eager for populist reforms, but obviously, as you probably know, in other countries, it's easier to do economic populism. Had they gone in a very broad-based social program incorporating the provinces, and for instance, giving them roads to access markets and to access ports, that's a major change. And I feel that's why I feel so positive with these new 8 ports, because that will allow many communities that today export things like potatoes, and they will benefit from those, no?
I mean, you look at trends in the rest of the region and Mexico, uh, Brazilian governments for the last 30 years, Argentina under the Kirchners. I mean, the trend has been toward more of these basic incomes. It is interesting that Peru's political class has not fully embraced that.
But I think that's something interesting to reflect on. because our political class is nothing else but a reflection of this divide. And they feel frustrated by not being able to benefit their communities. So they come to our Congress and they go for the easy ones, no? And the easy ones for them is to simply stand in a square and say, I'm going to increase your minimum wage, no? But we know that, for instance, when they say that, that's going to benefit, I don't know, 100,000, 50,000 workers out of 17 million, no? If we go the other direction, the one I'm suggesting of looking at social programs, we've done pretty well. We have reduced our poverty rate from over 50% to 20%. That's huge. No other Latin country has done that.
We'll be back with more after a short break.
What does AI's tectonic change mean for Latin America? Are youth losing faith in democracy? Can the region power up its lithium prospects? Latin America in Focus, a podcast of the America Society and Council of the Americas, takes on topics like these, giving context to the big issues affecting the region today. Subscribe to Latin America in Focus wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, let's talk about ports, which you just mentioned. You say in your article that Peru is a port hub overlooking the Pacific. There's new ports in Callao that will see capacity from that area expand, and it is forecast to surpass the shipping of other regional ports like Manzanillo in Mexico or Balboa in Panama. And then there's the port of Chancay, which is built by Chinese-owned Costco Shipping Ports Limited and Peru's Volcan S.A., a mining company. How can you help us understand the economic impact of all of this?
Well, Peru has always had a strategic position. I think it is not a surprise that for the Spaniards, Peru was one of the strongholds of their viceroys. No, Eh, my sense is that for some reason we never exploit that, and the Chinese have come and simply show us that we do have a strategic position. Usually, our ports they transport to the U.S., but they were very small ports. The Chinese, when they decide to invest in Costco, open up the idea that Peru has a strategic position vis-a-vis Asia. Now, in November, we are going to have 8 ports. We have a port concession to the Turks in the north. We have another port by a large investment group, the Romero family, also in the north. We have 2 ports in Callao, all of them doing merchant transporting containers from Peru to the Pacific. And the cost of that transport is going to reduce significantly and will attract, in my view, the transport of Ecuador, Chile, and Colombia. There are discussions with the Brazilians. My sense is that that's going to help tackle this connectivity I was mentioning before, because all of this will have to be transported through the Andes, and that will mean investing in infrastructure, in new roads, and that will connect the Andes with the coast, which is something that in the past we have not done.
I've heard some Peruvians in the private sector say, look, it's great that we've got these ports, but we are still going to be way behind when it comes to connectivity, the roads and railroads that lead to the port that would allow, for example, Brazilian soy to be exported through Callao or through Chancay.
I think, yes, at the beginning, that's going to be the case. But I think those roads are going to be developed.
So when would you say Peruvians might start to see these projects bear fruit, if they go as you're describing?
In our forecast, we believe that that's going to be gradual, as we pointed out before. It will be triggered by the investment in infrastructure. And that's something that probably will start sometime in 2025 and will take 5 or 10 years to sort of continue. No?
President Boluarte is due to visit China in June, and China's President Xi Jinping has confirmed his visit to Peru in November to inaugurate the new port. How would you say Boluarte is handling China's presence in Peru?
She's scheduled to travel in June to China at President Xi Jinping, and President Xi Jinping is due to inaugurate the port of Shanghai in November here at the APEC meeting. My sense is that most of the hurdles have been overcome, and now the port is going to be inaugurated in November and is going to start its activities in January. The first cargoes are going to be shipped in January. So my sense is that this goes beyond Dina and her government. This is something that has been done by the private sector, by this Volcan mining company, that they look for the investment from China. So this goes beyond the government. That's my view.
More broadly, how do you see Peru positioned in the competition between the U.S. and China that we're seeing in the region right now?
The U.S. is sort of asking us, but asking themselves, why have we not developed this port? Why the Chinese developing this port? The truth of the matter is that probably together with the rest of Latin America, we have been sort of a neighbor that they have not paid too much attention. No? And there hasn't been that many U.S. investments, actually. I haven't seen a U.S. investment in mining. In the past, in the 1940s, for instance, most of the investment in mining came from the U.S. Most of our railways were built by U.S. investors. Most of our highways were done by them. I met a couple of times with them, and my argument is, well, you have to shape up and you have to induce your entrepreneurs to come and invest in Peru. I don't think there's any question that our alignment is with the US. China has always been a country close to us. For instance, one of the strong immigrations in the 1800s came from China because they adapted much better to the highlands than other populations. So we have had this policy of sort of having both countries as our trading partners, but if it comes to having to decide, my sense is that we will have to opt for the US. No, there's no question about that. The question, I think, is different. The question is if the US is going to opt for us.
Alfredo, you've given us a lot to think about. Thanks very much for coming on the show. Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.